Good morning. Welcome to the final week of Imagining America's collective creative engagement, where artists, scholars, and organizers have been engaged in a month-long reimagining of America and a call to action leading up to the very soon approaching presidential election. My name is Erica Cole-Arenas. I'm the faculty director of Imagining America. I'm also faculty here at the University of California, Davis. This week, in our final week of our month-long engagement, we take on the question of radical, activist, public, and engaged scholarship and higher education itself. First, through the conversation we're about to have today about engaged graduate education, and today later at 3 p.m. Pacific time, a conversation with Barbara Ramsby, Stacy Sutton, and Margo Okazawa-Arey about the historic and current role of activist scholars in promoting just transitions. So we're really looking forward to the conversations today, and I thank you for joining us. I'm honored to welcome you to join the panelists today in a conversation about transforming campus culture and structure to better support public activists and community engaged graduate students. The panelists you will hear from today are all engaged in a larger Mellon Foundation sponsored and Imagining America organized project, the Leading and Learning Initiative. This project is organized by myself, by Cal Alston, who's the chair of the Imagining America National Advisory Board, as well as Christina Preston, who will be your organizer and moderator for today's conversation. The Leading and Learning Initiative, which we call the LLI, is a 3-year action research project to hold institutions of higher education accountable to supporting public and activist scholarship. And graduate research has always been a high priority of Imagining America. So the panelists you'll hear from today are engaged in some research on this very topic associated with the LLI. So we're excited they're here to join in conversation today. Before I introduce our moderator, Christina Preston, we should take a moment to acknowledge the land with which we are gathered. Collaboratively written by UC Davis and the Patwin people, we recognize that for thousands of years, this land has been the home of the Patwin people. Today, there are 3 federally recognized Patwin tribes: Kachil Dihi Band of Winton Indians of the Calusa Indian Community, Tletzel Dihi Winton Nation, and Yocha Dihi Winton Nation. The Patwin people have remained committed to the stewardship of this land over many centuries. It has been cherished and protected as elders have instructed the young through generations. We're honored and grateful to be here today on their traditional lands. So with that, I welcome you to join us in conversation, and I introduce Christina Preston, who's the research associate for Imagining America's Leading and Learning Initiative. She graduated with a Master's of Science in Community and Regional Development from UC Davis in 2016, also my alma mater. And she spent the last 3 years conducting oral histories with an isolated mining and ranching community in the northern Nevada desert. Prior to graduating Davis, Preston served as the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act coordinator at Sacramento State University. Interestingly, she also co-owns and manages a music recording studio with her partner in Pasadena, California. So as Paige folks like to always say, lives a interesting hybrid professional life. So with that, I turn it over to Christina to lead the conversation today. And I really appreciate all the scholars joining and presenting with us today. So welcome.
Hi, it's an honor to be here today to be moderating and discussing graduate student experiences as far as public scholarship. But before I jump into introducing all of the great panelists, and thank you, Erica, for the introduction. And I also want to say that I am in Pasadena right now, and I am coming from Tongva land, although normally I reside in Pilot Hill and reside on Nisenan Maidu land. But before I jump into introducing the panelists today, so we have 4, I would love to talk about their projects. So first, we have 2 public Mellon scholars that will be joining us today from the UC Davis Humanities Institute. We have Lizbeth de la Cruz Santana, and we have Alana Stein. This summer, they conducted over 20 interviews at UC Davis with public scholars from across disciplines on the campus to help the LLI develop a deeper understanding of the graduate student, public scholar, and activist experience on campus, and also to help us understand the barriers and also opportunities to support burgeoning public and activist scholars. Right now, they're in the midst of analyzing their findings from completing the interviews over the summer, and we're looking forward to eventually sharing that and also diving deep into that. We also have two scholars that are page co-directors, so that's publicly active graduate education, and their names are Romo and Gale Greenlee, and they are also conducting a separate project under the LLI. The page research project that they are conducting, and they're just about to embark on it, has several main functions to help develop an understanding of the importance, the need for, and the benefits of publicly engaged scholarship, to understand the institutional and cultural change barriers that are necessary to support public scholarship, and also the communities and spaces for which public scholarship is supported. Part of their project will focus on conducting interviews and focus groups and will continue on for the next 2 years. I would love for them to turn on their cameras so they can introduce themselves, starting with the Public Mellon Scholars. If we could have Alana Stein please give a self-introduction, that would be great.
Hi, as Christina said, my name is Alana Stein, and I go by the pronouns she and her. I'm a sociology graduate student at UC Davis, and I'm working on my dissertation right now. In the area of sociology, in addition to this work I've been doing with the LLI, my own public scholarship and research focuses on the food system and particularly private food assistance, as I study how people experience intersecting barriers as they try to interact with private food assistance programs, particularly food banks. So I look forward to talking to y'all today.
Thank you. And Lizbeth, can you please introduce yourself?
Right, thank you. And thank you everyone for joining us today. So just a short introduction. I rather go by Liz, and my last name is Cruz Santana, and I'm a fifth-year PhD candidate at UC Davis in the Spanish and Portuguese department with a designated emphasis on human rights. And my scholarship emphasizes the publicly engaged digital humanities method, and where I do research on the US-Mexico border related issues and also on the deportation of child arrivals. And as mentioned, I was part of the Leading and Learning Initiative this summer, and I am also a facilitator for digital storytelling for the Humanizing Deportation Archive and the Documented Dreams Without Borders activist archive as well. And thank you.
Wonderful. And can we also have the page co-directors, starting with Romo, do a self-introduction, please?
Thank you. Hello, all. So I'm Romo. I use they, them pronouns. I am a doctoral candidate in Cultural Foundations of Education with a concentration in History of Education at Syracuse University. You know, I want to acknowledge that folks have been naming where they're from, like where they're residing at the moment. And I just want to name that I am currently working with the community and also attending the institution that resides in Haudenosaunee land, you know, and that has been really critical in my own work of thinking about our social responsibility that universities have to the community and to the land, you know, and so in thinking about what does publicly engaged scholarship look like when engaging with these communities, like what is our personal role as not only individuals affiliated with the university, but also as individuals that are interested and value the work that is happening in the community. I've been involved with in America for the last 5 years. It has been a space in which I have felt supported, you know, and as I not only was a Page Fellow, but I also, as Christina mentioned, co-director. I just recently finished my term as a Page co-director and really shifting to doing the work of the LLI, the Leading and Learning Initiative, where I'm really grateful to be working with my colleague and friend, you know, Dr. Gale Greenlee. And with that, I want to pass it back to her.
Great, thank you. And Gale, can we have you do an introduction?
Sure, and thank you for that, Romo. I'm Gale Greenlee. I am a postdoc with the Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies Department at The Ohio State University, but I am Zooming from my mama's house in Western North Carolina, which sits on primarily Cherokee land. As Romo said, I've been affiliated with PAGE and IA for a while as well, having been a PAGE fellow, and then a co-director for a couple of years, and now serving as one of the co-investigators on the graduate school component of the LLI project. My own research focuses on Black and Latinx girlhood studies in literature and pop culture, and I'm just really excited to be here.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here today. I'm excited to hear from all of you. We are also joined by the wonderfully talented VanMuijen. She will be joining us from Rogue Mark Studios in Berkeley, and she'll be graphically facilitating this discussion today. So, Abby, could you give us an introduction?
Sure. My introduction, I'm going to let my visuals and the things that I'm making speak for themselves and introduce themselves. So I'm going to share my screen really quickly because my job is to be taking visual notes of the panelists. Like Christina said, I'm coming from Berkeley, which is on Lijon Ohlone land. And I wanted to, as I pull this up, invite you all that if you'd like to sort of play around with your screen sizes, there's sort of a bar in the middle where you can zoom in or out on the visual notes to either sort of prioritize seeing those a little bit bigger or prioritize seeing sort of the panelists and faces. But yeah, that is me. I will be taking some visual notes to hopefully provide a more visual documentation of all of the incredible content that I know we're going to talk through. So I'm deeply grateful to be here, and I'm always inspired by the content that I hear at Imagining America events. So thank you for having me.
Thank you, Abby. Before we start today, we just want to note that we encourage all participants to answer the questions that we're also asking the panelists today. We very much also want to hear your own personal reflections and responses. And you can also put your questions in the chat, and we will do our very best based on time to answer those questions at the end of this panel. We will also putting up the email addresses of all the panelists. If there are any unanswered questions, feel free to also contact, but yes, please, we will be putting the questions in the chat and feel free to respond. We're very much looking forward to hearing from all of you about your own experiences as we share our own. But for the sake of time, let's just jump into the first question that we have. So this first question, and I'm going to read it out loud. So, how do structures in the university, more specifically the graduate school experience, create barriers to graduate students' engagement in public scholarship? And I'm going to call on Alana to answer this question and give us her thoughts on this.
Yeah, so from the research that we did this summer, myself and Liz, we really saw that there were a lot of barriers that were specific to the graduate student experience for how people faced issues as they did public scholarship as graduate students. So some of the earlier work and prior scholarship in this area has really focused on the process of obtaining tenure, but we found in our work that we saw these processes happening, structural barriers, much before scholars are getting to the point of trying to obtain tenure. So we found that as scholars are trying to do their dissertation, they really struggle to fit their dissertation work and their public scholarship together. So this can be because of the way that dissertations are structured and expected to be in terms of individualistic pursuits. This can also be in terms of the faculty that are overseeing the dissertation. And that's one of the other barriers that we saw was the struggle of even when public scholars were able to find a supportive advisor or a few supportive advisors to oversee their work, it was really difficult to fill a full committee for dissertations and qualifying exam with faculty that were both experts in the scholars area and also supportive of public scholarship. So even in the committees that the public scholars were selecting, people were still having to include faculty who may not be as supportive of the public scholarship parts of their work, which often led them to do double the work. And then a final issue that we saw is as people were leaving graduate school, they faced barriers with the academic job market. So trying to get into the academic job market being this final barrier before even reaching the tenure track job.
Wonderful. Liz, I was wondering if you could jump in and let us know your thoughts on this.
Yes, and I definitely agree with everything Alana mentioned, because from the interviews we conducted this summer, it seems that there's this feeling of the positive and the negative in being part of the university, doing engaged public scholarship. And speaking on the more positive experiences that were shared, it seems that students did feel that the university was supportive with the financial support with stipends or grants to do the research during the summer. But unfortunately, they also felt tokenized and used by the university or even their programs, specifically when there was no real support. And I think that raises a red flag in regards in how is the institution, and speaking about the academic world, how is this world really going to support public scholars when at the end of the day, the support that the scholar needs to collaborate with the community is not really there. And at the end, they take credit for the work that they're doing. And yes, we are part of our programs, and I include myself in this dialogue, but at the end of the day is that we need the practical tools to be able to do these research or the projects that we want to do with community. And another thing that also came about in the research for this summer was the different emotions that happen or that are created during field work or in doing this type of research. And there's really no support in the university to help students dealing with the emotions or the aftermath of listening to a lot of stories that are triggering, especially when you're working with your own community. And I think that's really important to also acknowledge. And it seems that it's not part of our scholarship or as part of our graduate student manual, but it's a real thing that I feel we should really focus on. And coming from a digital humanities background, I think that it is important to also be ready and prepared. So maybe have the university provide some type of training and where the students know how to manage their own feelings, but what if these things also happen when working with community? How are we training our students to go out and do this amazing work when at the end of the day, it's very difficult? So those were some of the two main things that I feel were vital in this for this question, but just financial support is another key issue, and not just for research, but for living expenses, specifically for the summer. So I'll leave it with that in case someone else wants to jump in.
I'd like to ask a follow-up question really quickly. As I know we talked about this earlier in other conversations, would either anybody on the panel like to discuss the expense of public scholarship? Because I think in earlier conversations, we talked about public scholarship being something that is not only emotionally heavy in labor, often for different reasons, working with communities and activism, and for many other reasons, but would anyone want to jump in and discuss the expense of public scholarship, particularly for the graduate student?
Sure, I'll go ahead and weigh in. What's interesting to me, I'm thinking about what Erica was saying during her introduction. What do we mean when we say public scholarship? Because we can be talking about activists, radical activist scholarship, which is very different, not necessarily the same thing as community-based scholarship or public scholarship if you are writing op-eds or speaking in the media. And I think there are certain forms that are deemed pretty legitimate within academic spaces and carry not the same kind of risk as if you were involved in more activist, scholar activist practices, especially if you're involved in those kind of direct actions on your own campus and speaking out about inequities that you see the institution at the hands of the institution. And so, you know, it can be risky, not only in terms of having being blackballed in a sense, or having a reputation on campus, having funding stripped from you, that sort of thing, but then also the emotional weight of that you are committed to this cause, but at the same time, you know that you're putting yourself at risk because you are countering the very institution that you're operating under.
Thank you, Gail. Is there anybody else really quick before we move on to the next question that would like to say anything about this particular topic? Go ahead, Liz.
Yeah, I would love to add I remember two key interviews. The interviewees expressed that public scholarship is expensive. And when they mentioned that, I was like, wow, like I've always been afraid to actually admit it and to say, yes, it's expensive. And especially if for example, you do get funding for the projects. The projects don't just stop during the summer, they continue throughout the whole school year. So what happens is that public scholars use their own stipends or they do fundraisers with the community to be able to support these projects. So I think that's really important to acknowledge as well, and to see, let's find funding that lives beyond just the summer or a quarter. And I think that's really important. So definitely, yes, public scholarship is expensive, but it's important. So we find ways to make it happen. And I think with the support of the community, it's possible through like fundraisers and GoFundMe or even using our own Venmo. So those type of things I think should be taken into consideration as well.
Thank you, Liz. For the sake of time, we're going to move on to the second questions. The second question is, what structures and spaces within or outside the university facilitate graduate student engagement in public-facing work? Romo, I would love if you could respond to this.
Yeah, thank you, Christina. And so, as mentioned earlier, we are still currently just about to start really in November to begin to look at some of our own research questions for the LLI. So we haven't really necessarily gotten an opportunity to speak to graduate students at this moment. However, I want to highlight how important this question is to address, especially as identifying these structures and spaces has been an ongoing interest as a form to like legitimize publicly engaged scholarship within academia, for example, or support graduate students who are engaging in publicly engaged scholarship, as well as strategies to connect universities to their local community and larger society. And so this is something that we're interested in thinking, especially as my colleagues are talking about these barriers and these challenges, like what are the spaces, what are the people that folks are connecting to that are cultivating and also allowing them to really push their work to where they want it to be or where the community wants it to go, and so I really want to speak more into my personal experiences as well as other conversations with Page alumni, given that I've been working as a co-director for the last 5 years with a lot of alumni that we had an opportunity to really create spaces to have these conversations, not only from how do we define our work, right? And, I see Gale also, shaking their head in conversations that we've been having that also think about, what are these spaces that we need to be advocating for or also supporting, right? And so these aspects really vary depending on the values and missions of our department, from requirements and timelines, right, to financial and like mentorship support level. These things shift. However, some of these common things that kind of arose were people really talking about seeking spaces like Imagining America, like, the graduate network of IA, the Page, and really seeking these outside spaces to be able to support, that value that push their work further, right? And so I really definitely would love to hear also what Gale has to say this, because I'm just trying to also think about just some of these common themes around these spaces and how sometimes there are faculty that support their work, and sometimes there's even limitations within their department, and so therefore push folks to seek other spaces like IA.
Romo, I could actually just ditto most of what you said, thinking about my personal experience in grad school, as well as conversations with those involved with Page and other public scholar programs. And so speaking like from my experience at UNC Chapel Hill, which is where I went to school, there were several funding opportunities that I think assisted students in very necessary ways, because most of us are not coming to grad school with oodles of, financial resources. And so there were fellowships. If you were doing community-based research, if you had a community-based project, there were seed monies that you could apply for and that were encouraged. There were curriculum that were accessible through a graduate certificate program in community-based participatory research, and that was open and is open to anyone regardless of departmental affiliation. So you could be in public health or business or in a humanities discipline and undertake this certificate and really understand and develop a foundation of what it means to work with the community and not just working in a community, and doing so, in an equitable manner. And so those resources definitely are out there. I was even made aware of some dissertation fellowships, some for quote unquote alternative dissertations. So projects, I'm remembering one from American Studies graduate who focused on education in her home state of Mississippi. And she was creating an exhibition as well as an app alongside the more traditional dissertation narrative that would be submitted to the committee. And so I think that there are some supports, and they definitely serve a purpose in terms of making you visible within an institution that doesn't always recognize public scholarship. There's a whole nother conversation we can have about what that means to then be institutionalized when public scholarship becomes institutionalized. But the funding support is definitely necessary. I think in terms of other supports, I've really, myself, as well as others I've been in conversation with, have looked outside of the academy, quite honestly, in many community spaces. So a lot of the work that I have done, whether it's been arts-based or if I participated in direct actions locally, it's been because of relationships I had with people before I even entered graduate school, or relationships I developed in graduate school with people who have absolutely nothing to do with the academy. And so sometimes you're actually, waiting between both of these different spaces to try to maintain your sanity as well as maintain grounding in the type of work that you want to do in the world.
I think these are all excellent points. I know personally, just for myself, doing a master's, the funding was not available because of timelines, and I had to look on outside sources, for instance, even civic groups, more likely to fund than within the university. So I think these are all excellent points, and that public scholars often find themselves in a place of having to be creative, and whether it's funding or finding support, whether in your department or outside your department or civic organizations or the community. So I think these are all excellent points. Did anyone else want to add anything? Alana?
I think one of the things that came up in our interviews of a place that, like, particularly a structure that really facilitated public scholarship within the university was departments and disciplines that were founded in activist roots. So particularly at UC Davis, the Native American Studies department came up as a very supportive structure that really supported public scholarship. So I think it's important to turn to ethnic studies disciplines and other disciplines that have really been founded in activist roots and community-based work to look to how structures can facilitate public scholarship within the university.
Thank you. I think that's an excellent point. Native American Studies program, especially at Davis, is so much founded within activism, and personally, even reflecting on my own experience, that is where I found my support in doing my work. And I don't think, reflecting back, that some of my work would have been possible without that point. So I think that's an excellent point. Is there anybody else before we'd like to move on to the next question? Romo.
I just really wanted to add that one of the key things that I recall also talking about is like this need to be grounded. And when folks talk about like grounding and thinking about the reason and the value for why they do, specifically publicly engaged scholarship has been like family and community, right? Like always going back to the community, and wanted to make sure that I didn't do a disservice by not naming that as also an important space outside, of academia.
Thank you. That's also an excellent point. There's so many people that do this type of work that this is built into who they are. And so this makes this work even especially heavy and important and labor intensive. As we move on to the next question. This is question number 3. How do power relations shape the experience of graduate students engaged in public scholarship? Could I call on Gale to respond to this?
Lord, that's a complicated question. I'm seeing and know and understand that power operates on every level in every institution that we're involved in every relationship we're involved in. So whether we're talking about the big picture academy or higher ed as a system that we're all, a part of, and then on smaller levels, the level of the institution that you are going to graduate school at, as well as the relationship between you and your advisor. And I think that all of these affect public scholarship, scholar activism tremendously on the institution level. I know from having witnessed in many occasions that oftentimes if grad students are involved in direct action again on campus, that these are instances where you see institutions and administrations really wielding their power in some ways that are just really deceitful and harmful, whether it's threats of enrollment, threats of losing stipends, of positions, of funding, of health benefits, et cetera, if you lose your assistantship. So you see that at play. But then also, I think many of us may feel it on that one-on-one, in that one-on-one relationship with an advisor who, like other panelists were talking about, may not get what public scholarship is, may not understand that vision that you have for the work that you want to do, that you see yourself doing, that you've already been doing, and that you want graduate school to, help you continue after you leave the university. And that's no small matter. It's a real concern. How do you navigate that if your advisor does not believe in this thing called public scholarship? If your department is a very traditional one and may be hostile towards you doing anything outside of the parameters of traditional scholarship.
Exactly. I was reflecting on this myself. It's just it requires to do public scholarship that one often has to power map within the university or even in their committee. And it's very unusual for someone to have a committee that is full of public scholarship. It's extremely rare. I would also love for Alana, if you would like to jump in and let us know your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I think Gale brought up some really important points about how there's so many places where there's power inequalities. And I think I'd like to focus a little more on like some of those dynamics between faculty and graduate students, because I think it's really important to highlight that not only are graduate students relying on faculty as part of their education and ultimately hopefully approving their dissertation and their graduate school work, but students are also reliant on these faculty for their employment both now and in the future. So both their current employment as teaching assistants and graduate student researchers is reliant on faculty support, as well as this very nebulous sort of idea of what is the faculty going to write in a letter of recommendation that you're never going to see. So there's always graduate students are reading in between the lines what might be happening in these circumstances and wondering how that might impact their future employment and career aspects as well. I think it's also important to highlight power relationships between graduate public scholars and the communities as well. So as public scholars, we're coming from universities that have historically been extractive of these communities often. But at the same time, graduate students don't have substantial resources and support from the university. So as Liz mentioned earlier, there's not much funding that's going into graduate students to support these communities. But as we try to change and fix these relationships to be non-extractive with communities, that requires a lot of financial support. And there's a lot of power relations that graduate students need to contend with, navigating their own position with the university, but also as a representative of the university to the community.
Excellent point that being in this role often requires you to be a part of different power structures within the community, within the university, within your committee. often leaves a public or activist scholar being pulled in multiple directions and still worrying about, having all these different, being in multiple worlds and wondering how this will end in, a career development or finding a profession where you're not only beholden to your committee, but also to the community that you work with. Does anyone else want to add anything to this?
I just wanted to add, and this is piggybacking on something that Romo said about support, just the necessity of being grounded in your community, whatever community that is, whatever you envision it to be, because if you're trying to navigate being part of the academy and also being part of the community, there's a whole nother level of stress that comes along with that. And just being rooted in the community that you are part of, the community that you are working along with, that you are hoping to impact in really meaningful ways is just absolutely necessary.
Exactly. And Roma, I think I saw you raise your hand as well.
Yeah, but I think Gale really brought it home in thinking about, I think it's important to think about when we do this work, how these identities, right, as Gale mentioned, as a student, right, as a community member, if, you're going to a university that is part of your community, right, or to if you identify as an activist or, doing community work, those identities are constantly a part of us. And when things arise at the institution, when things arise in the community, when tensions occur, when violence is happening, whether it be in inequalities in the institution or outside of the university that you're a part of, sometimes we have to choose what those identities, what are we prioritizing? Yes, I think I say, where do we stand, right? And so, what is our priority? What is our responsibility? And we have to often choose what at times that the community need or the need for direct action that goes against and pushes back on the institution that we are affiliated with, right, is needed. And often then that causes, there's consequences to that as a student, and so I just wanted to definitely emphasize that part of those power dynamics exist not only as individuals that are implicated within this institution, but also how we also internalize and carry those things sometimes within our community too.
Which brings us to the fourth question, which relates to the last question. How do timelines shape public scholarship in graduate school? How does that affect? Liz, if you could respond to this question.
Yes, and I think this question builds on most of the things that we've talked about, right? And from our interviews, most scholars viewed their public scholarship as something separate from their dissertations, which I think is very problematic, and that we need to really look into ways in which, if the dissertation needs to remain as part of our graduate milestone to complete our PhD, then how can we really transform this to support public scholars? Or how can we also maybe in a way change the way that our programs are basically validating this type of work? And another point is that these, as a result, impact in some capacity the quote unquote success of their graduate program or their standing as successful students in academia. And as well, I think that from my own personal experience as well is that we feel like we're living two different lives and navigating multiple worlds in the ways that we talk about our work, the way that we present our work, and how we choose to also do our public facing work. So I think with all of that in mind, definitely the traditional route of a graduate student is complex, and it's not just one single way that you could follow. And that gives us the impression that there's no guide for graduate students to follow if they want to do engaged work with the community. And that brings us to the point that, okay, so if you want to do this type of work and you want to remain in academia, which is the case with most of us, I feel that there needs to be a rapid change in the way that the tenure track is basically obtained and how our work is credited or not credited. And to also bring in questions of what work is valued. So those things do impact, the timeline for success in graduating. or to even remain in academia, because there's been people who came into their graduate program but left because they didn't see themselves being able to navigate this type of world, and where the work with community is seen as something that is your extracurricular activity or your volunteer time instead of your research question for your dissertation. So those two things is, at the end of the day, you have to figure out where is your loyalty, with your academic route or with your community. And if you do choose to stay, how are you navigating those two things and still being a successful graduate student in academia? So for me, those were some of the most important aspects that were brought up in the interviews. And one of the last things that I would love to mention is that the funding timelines and also the research projects that we engage in don't always align with the community, or the community, basically, they don't need the projects that we envision. But if they do need those projects and they want us to continue working on these, then it's really difficult to say no when we already started working with them or collaborating with them. And at the end, we have to say, I'm sorry, I can't continue because there's no funding. I can't do this anymore because I'm now a candidate, or my degree is demanding certain things from me. So how do we navigate these situations? So obviously, in most cases, public scholars do engage with the community and continue to do so even after their programs and they obtain their degree. But I think it's really important to also bring that into consideration, that at the end of the day, and at least from my perspective, the community helps to support the grad student in their academic endeavors. And it kind of bounces off from question number 3. And in my experience, I feel that with the community that I've been able to create through my graduate program, and by community, I mean the folks that I work with outside the academic space, they are the ones who support my work in academia. So I basically stay because I see that my work does have some value for them. So at the end of the day, it goes to asking that question, who is our public and who are we writing for? And I'll leave it with that as a reflection.
And Romo, briefly, would you like to share your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I actually been thinking a lot around timeline, just more broadly thinking about how these notion of this linear timeline of like where we should be, whether it be cohort model, whatever your department may be using, this idea that folks can move along at the same rate at the same time, just like everybody else. I think we need to like also just think about that and pause and really think about the dangers of that, because that I don't think that considers a lot of people's identities, not only social, but also personal identities, such as what it means to be a first generation student, a parent, someone who cares for family members, right? Doesn't consider ability, race, and kind of other structures that make it a lot difficult for people to move to the next stage at the same rate as other folks, and I think a lot of this has been more amplified through current pandemic, right? More folks are now coming in and talking to their departments and saying, hey, these requirements for work experiences or these things that I'm responsible for doing is now being, it's either made difficult or not possible due to the pandemic. And so I think more and more departments are now considering these issues. However, we're still looking at it in relation to the pandemic and not as the pandemic is simply amplifying already these existing inequalities that really make it difficult for folks not only to be moving along in their stage and their work, but then what does it also then mean when those individuals on top of these identities are also doing publicly engaged work that then come up with these challenges that, Liz has brought up, for example, right? What does it mean when the pandemic is also impacting the community that we're working with in ways that make it either difficult to be doing particular work with them, or they're asking us to do something completely different that does not align to that work. And maybe either we have to shift our work or we have to put a pause to whatever we were collecting and we do direct action that the community is asking for, right? And I think that for me, that has been something that has been on my mind, not only currently, but also more broadly of how do we reimagine, what it means to think about timelines as a whole.
Wonderful, Romo. Thank you for that. As we move on, we're running a little bit short on time. I want to get to something a bit more hopeful in question 5, and if we could all take 1 minute in response. But how can we reimagine the graduate school experience to be a place that nourishes public scholarship? Alana, could I call on you?
Yes, I think I'd really like to see us reimagine graduate school as something that's not such an individualistic pursuit, but something that's really people coming together collaboratively with people in communities and also with other scholars. So working on this LLI project together with Liz and talking to Gale and Romo has been really fruitful. And I think there's room to build more of these structures into how we structure graduate school and the requirements. So specifically rethinking the dissertation, and we've seen the dissertation rethought to be from a book manuscript to the 3-article model. But what does it mean to reimagine a dissertation that's supportive of public scholarship?
Great. Romo?
Yeah, so I've also been thinking about, in regards to this question, how us as individuals engaging in public scholarship, how our work should be or action oriented, right? Like, where is the reimagination in each of our work, right? And so like, I hope that as we're answering these questions, people are also thinking about how does my individual work reimagine some of these aspects, right? And so when I think about my work, I think about what is training, what does support look like for graduate students interested in and or engaging already in publicly engaged scholarship, so that we consider not only recognize the university's historical and ongoing participation in these multiple waves of colonization. What does that then look like as we go into these communities to avoid these extractive relationships that Alana mentioned? I think that is critical of thinking about that, right? How do we reimagine a space that really is actively not only in relationship with the people, but actively also reflecting on our personal role and of going into the community and doing the work.
And Gale?
I absolutely agree with both Romo and Alana. One thing I would love to see is just a complete dismissal of this public/university divide. There are some very real power dynamics at play and some real divisions, but I get slightly annoyed when I hear about the public, because the kids in your classroom are coming from somewhere. They're coming from some of the very publics or communities that you're hoping to engage and work with. Many of the graduate students, everyone's not coming from privileged backgrounds, right? There are people who are coming from the border, who are coming from rural communities, who are coming from urban centers, who are coming from all over and have these very grounded experiences that we should recognize. And I think I would also like to see a reworking of curriculum with graduate students playing an active role in that. And by that, I mean, allowing space for some creativity. And just at the forefront of my mind is this project that happened over the summer called the Black Feminist Summer School. Shout out to Ebony Oldham, who was with Ohio State and now with UCLA. She was the curator of that, graduate student, and just really provided a model of open access education, definitely community rooted, politicized, and meaningful, and something that you wouldn't necessarily see coming out of an academic program. So I think we need to look bigger, dream bigger.
And Liz, thank you, Gale.
Yes, I would love to emphasize that I feel that we should definitely reimagine different ways in where we could invite community to be a part of the conversations and research that we conduct with them and not about them. And I think that's really important. So for example, something that I've started to notice now with the pandemic, which I think could be a positive thing that's coming out of all of this, is that panelists are also, communities are being invited to be part of active conversations in academia. And I think it's really important to also pay them for their labor, because when we present I think it's also important to highlight that grad students should get paid for their labor, but at this same, and we're putting it both in the same scope, everyone for their knowledge creation should be getting paid for their time, specifically with community, because I think at the end of the day, a lot of the research that we all do is based on their willingness to participate in the research questions that we have or the project. So I think that's really important and valuable as well. And I'm really happy to start seeing that and that change, and also uplifting their voices, but having them speak for themselves instead of us just, you know, talking about what they lived. And so I think that's really important. And then another question that I have, and I don't think I'm gonna get a real answer for this anytime soon, but is how do you even talk about your own work as a student and when going into the academic job search? And I think that's really important to see, and a question that I always ask myself is like, how do you sell yourself ethically without, and I think the word sell sounds horrible, but at the end of the day, I feel that the academic life that most of us are currently living is making us have these conversations. And why do I feel like I'm selling myself or that I'm being used? Because at the end of the day, whatever systems we're navigating in academia are making us feel this way. So I think there needs to be a urgent change in that, because it does impact the work that we can do.
Thank you. And we're running a bit short and close on time. I know we had one question from the audience, and I would love if you all could respond and chat your reflections on this. But we had a question that says, what commitment do you provide to the community who you are working with? Some communities are over-researched, and although they value the research, they also want this research to not only be a one-time affair. If I could have all 4 of the panelists answer in chat their response to this, we're going to move on to have Abby show her slides from the work that she has graphically facilitated, and then also Erica do a closing remarks. I feel like we could go on for a long time in this conversation, which I just want to say at the very end, if there's anybody that would like to engage in dialogue that may have been a panelist, it would be great if you could send your email out to us or respond to any of the emails we'll put on screen. I'm going to hand this over to Erica. And again, if all the panelists might take a moment to look in chat and perhaps answer some of the questions, I think that would be great. And thank you so much for all of your responses.
Thank you, Christina. I think we do have, actually, before I close us out, at least three to 4 minutes left. If folks wanted to answer verbally that question from the chat really quickly. We do have a couple more minutes.
Yeah, can I go ahead and just answer it? I think one of the key words that I learned through the Mellon Public Scholars seminar that I took last year was the word reciprocity. And I think that when I basically came, I learned what that meant. I was like, wow, that's so important. And I think it's not something that we learn in the classroom, but in actually actively doing the work or collaboration with communities. So reciprocity, and in that sense is, working together, finding ways to really push conversations in an ethical way. And for me, that's really key. So yes, and I think that's really important how, yes, some research or communities are over-researched, and like how much are we gonna extract from these conversations, but how can we create change? So that's where, for me, it's really important to acknowledge what's going on, but also push for either policy or anything that would actually impact the community in a positive way.
So if we have time, I definitely would like to answer this question, as this is something that I've often struggled with, especially because I think that the work that I'm trying to do is really troubling publicly engaged scholarship, right? And really thinking about how we do that work, and how that not only looking at it in the history of the land in which these universities are residing on as like related to these extractive relationships and displacement, right? And how often some universities also do not return back resources financially, for example, to the community, and how then us as individuals affiliated with the university going into the community can potentially continue to maintain that relationship, right? And so I've definitely been thinking about that. And for me, my commitment, and I made a decision that my work would really be more around highlighting that history of the institution in which I'm in, to really think about it more broadly. For me, it was about, how do I speak to this work, highlight, right, Indigenous, Black, and people of color organizing and scholarship already inside and outside of the university, right? And then also, how do I hold that institution responsible, right, to some of the issues that we are already addressing in our work, right? So what does that look like? What does that look like when we go in attempting to address an issue that the university was implicated in, right? And I think that that is the commitment that we have to do, be willing to talk about the dirty, right, the bad. Sometimes not just looking at, the great work that we're doing, but also like how we're implicated in that just by being affiliated with that institution.
Would anyone else like to respond to this?
Yes, I think building on like what the other panelists have said, I think, yeah, it's really important to do work that the community wants and has a desire for. And I think particularly this part of the question about how do you make this research to not only be a one-time affair, I think that's why we need to look at these structures within the university and graduate school and really try to change those. Because the funding structures we have now don't allow for a lasting commitment to a place. The timelines we have now don't allow for graduate students to really extensively work with a community over time, especially as they transition from being a graduate student to having a career in academia. And I think those places are important to look at, of how we can create more lasting relationships with communities and people, and really create long-lasting relationships.
These are all excellent points, and it's a complicated question, and many of these questions were because everyone's experience and everyone's public scholarship is often very personal and unique, and the many different issues surrounding doing public scholarship and the opportunities vary across institution, across person, across different factors, from funding to just the tools that one might have at hand to help, or people to assist. I thank you all for your knowledge and wisdom, and these conversations I think are something that I hope go on and continue, because they're so important, especially for people who are doing this work, who often feel isolated, and that these problems are perhaps just isolated to their own experiences and yet aren't part of a larger systemic issue across institutions. So thank you for all of your wisdom.
So thank you, Christina, so much for that. And, I just am so moved and called to task by this really, I think, deep and reflective conversation. So I want to thank each and every one of you for not only being here today and raising these critical, and I know sometimes difficult questions and conversations for those of you that are still in this journey, right? So these aren't easy questions to raise, and it's also not just simply research, it's organizing and care work on a daily basis. So I really appreciate you leading this conversation, organizing the conversation, and for building out this research project. I am so honored that each of you are committed to doing this work and to doing this work together in the coming years. So I didn't mention up front, but the Leading and Learning Initiative, we're investing in 2 years of research, and the third year really will be a call to action. So this research will result not just in a white paper, but in some organizing tools. So you will be hearing more from each of us and from us collectively. So really, really thank you for that. To everyone who joined us today, thank you for joining and zooming in. There will be follow-up in terms of how to get involved yourselves. And I'd like to draw attention to a couple things this coming week. This is our last week, as I mentioned, of the online collective creative engagement leading up to the election. And if you want to look out for future items on the program this week, please go to iagathering.org. And if you're inspired by the conversation today, I draw your attention to two things. One is please look out for the page video talks linked to the homepage of iagathering.org. Many of us love the page lightning talks at the IA Gathering every year. And since we can't go and participate those in person, the current year of fellows has recorded some gorgeous, amazing, moving video talks. So please go and check them out. And second, I would draw your attention to today's plenary panel at 3 p.m. Radical Scholars Explore Just Transitions. It'll really be a second part two of this important conversation. Barbara Ramsby and Stacy Sutton will talk as longtime activist scholars themselves about the founding of Scholars for Social Justice, as well as the launch of a new project called the Portal Project that addresses some of these questions about living and working across movements and higher ed. So please join us. Margot Okazawa-Ray will also really bring home the importance of internationalism and doing work in global solidarity. She does a lot of work with Palestine, as well as looking long haul from the Third World Liberation movement that founded some of those very programs that you all mentioned in the 60s and 70s to today. So thank you all so much for joining us, and we'll see you again at 3 p.m. Pacific time, hopefully, for our second round on this conversation. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. One last thing, can we also just, Romo asked me to remind everyone that we are definitely interested in having these conversations further. Again, if you are interested in engaging with any of us from Paige to the public scholars, please private message or email. The slide is about to come up on with all of the emails for the contact information for everyone. And please, we hope to hear and engage with you more.
And thank you, Abby, for the beautiful graphic facilitation. We'll share everything back with participants shortly.